All right, today we'll be talking about the Iroquois. Iroquois are one of my personal favorites. I like them quite a bit. They are very familiar. When we think of Indians in Hollywood and so forth, we're pretty much thinking of the Iroquois. Before we get started, though, I want to just point out the double entry notes. This is how we're going to set up our notes each day. We got the passage and page, main ideas, and reflections. So, for instance, the first thing we put is Six United and page 42 right here. And that will go right here, Six United, page 42, and then we'll write our main idea and details of what we read from this section here. Whatever this says will go into this area here, and then anything that we think of, whatever it reminds us of, or doodles, or whatever, we can put that in this section here. And obviously, we'll go to Life in the Longhouse, page 42 goes right here, Life in the Longhouse, page 42, and then we start writing the main ideas and details. So let me just demonstrate that. It was with Six United, page 42. So let me just type. No, that won't work. Okay, so Six United, page 42 would go here. All right, so let's get into it. As you can see here in the New York State, along the St. Lawrence River, um, the Erie Lake, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario, this whole area right here was dominated by the Iroquois. We call this area the Eastern Woodlands, so we should definitely have that in your notes. And they were combined by five tribes: the Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca. And later on, the Tuscarora joined them. Now it says here in the book that Iroquois means rattlesnakes, but they call themselves the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. So it's strange because in the Inuit, they had a name, the Eskimo, they didn't like it, but we call them Inuit. But for some reason, we are not. I guess it's just because it's so darn hard to say Haudenosaunee for sixth graders, so we're just going to call them Iroquois, even though they're not too fond of it. But I think it's kind of cool. Rattlesnakes. That sounds intimidating. Yeah, I mean, if people said, "Oh man, be careful, it's rattlesnakes," makes it sound powerful. Anyway, longhouse, life in the longhouse. This is what they lived in. Obviously, when you live in the eastern woodlands, the longhouses were built out of wood, and as you can see here, they were very long. In fact, they were as long as two school buses end to end, so that you can get an idea just how long these longhouses were. Um, Many people lived in each one. And one interesting thing is that they built palisades around the villages. Now, if you're not familiar with what palisades are, it's basically like a wooden fort. They put wood stakes going all the way around, and that basically keeps out wild animals, enemies. I remember going to what was it? Um, Natural Bridge over here in Virginia, and they would make the Palisades kind of swirl. The entrance would come in, not directly into the village, but it would go basically to the side, and you'd have to go around the village a little bit to get into the village. And that was one way they slowed down enemies from getting into their area because it was pretty heavily populated. Unlike the Inuit or the Pueblo, where they did not have quite as many people in that area because of the harsher conditions, or they weren't as protected from other tribes like the Kwakiutl, were a very isolated area. Um, the Lakota were in a very vast open area. There were many tribes that lived side by side, and they fought quite a bit in this area, so they had to build up their defenses to make sure that they were protected. So we've got longhouses and palisades. That's something you should take note of. Um, they also ate things that we'd be familiar with: corn, beans, squash. They called them the Three Sisters because they grew in perfect harmony together. And they went fishing. They hunted deer and things we would find around here today. And they would harvest plants, gather fruit, because they had a long winter. Being up in the north, it does get cold there, and it's harder to find food. Um, you have the Pueblo. They had a different lifestyle, but they had the four seasons, and they had to deal with them when things were going well and when it was warm, and they had to prepare for the winter when things were tougher. Okay, so that's the food. As far as clothing, they wore animal skins. They it doesn't really go into it here, but animal skins were the main thing that they would use for clothing. So a couple things about the Iroquois. One reason why they were so powerful is this man right here, De Canawida. Okay, he lived in the late 1500s, and he went around to all the neighboring tribes and got them together and created the Great Law of Peace, which basically settles all disputes. It's a system of being respectful to each other, and when there's a problem, they would sit down, they'd talk about it instead of just going and punching each other in the face or something. They would talk about their disputes and figure out a way to get things done. And this was a way for them to decide just how those disputes would go down. They also had a system that if the chiefs um, could lose their power if they behaved badly, so kind of like an impeachment system, they would get rid of the chiefs that were not doing the will of the people. And something that was really interesting here is that women had a lot of power. Even though they could not be the chiefs, they were the ones who decided who was going to be a chief. They basically had the vote. So that's pretty powerful. Even though they were not the leaders, they had the power to decide who was going to be the leader. So that's a pretty interesting balance of power there. The Great Law of Peace brought years of prosperity and peace to them because they became so powerful with all those tribes working well together. It was a very tough combination to beat, and what we'll find later in chapter 4 is that the Iroquois actually side with the British against the French in the French and Indian War, so they were fairly friendly with the English-speaking Europeans um, for quite a long time. They were, like I said, they're one of my favorites, so I like them, and this really helps their case too here, where they were basically the inventors of the sport lacrosse. Now, if you watch lacrosse, it's kind of like hockey with these things right here. I forget what they're called, but you catch the ball in here and then you throw it with it, and instead of just playing on a field, entire towns played against each other, and it would last for days, and the playing field often stretched for miles. So you can imagine a game that just goes on and on for days and days, and goes on from one end of the blue field to the other. That must have been an epic game. I would love to have seen something like that. Okay, well that's the Iroquois, and just make sure that when you're going through and reading these sections here from now on, so when we go on to chapter 3, that's what you're going to do. So you're going to, and then when you don't have one of these captions here, they usually happen in the beginning of the 2 pages. So for instance, when we get to this right here, there's nothing at the top. I would just use the main title here. Why Explore would be the title of this one. So we put Why Explore, uh, page 48, and then we would write about this one. But that's for chapter 3. But I just wanted you to be aware of what we're doing with the notes and double entry. Now, this is in your workbook. I highly recommend making copies of this if you can, but if you can't, you just draw this box in your loose leaf paper and just make a chart, and then you draw, when you finish this part right here, you draw a line, start a new one. Then when you're done writing all this stuff, you draw the line underneath it so that you have plenty of room to put things down. So that's how we're going to be taking notes for the rest of the year. Hopefully you were able to keep up and figure out how to do this. Just put in, again, I'm not expecting earth-shattering notes, just we're dipping our toe into the whole note-taking thing, just taking a piece of what's in the book and then putting it right here in our notes to help us remember, because there is quite a bit of information already that we see in this book that we have to remember. So it's really important that we do get a handle on the note taking.